Chris Dalla Riva, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
In 1958, Billboard published its first Hot 100 list. You decided to research all the songs that appeared on that list over the past 7 decades. After reviewing over 1,000 number one songs, what do you think is more critical in creating a number one hit? The skill of the artist or the luck of the timing of when it comes out?
I hate to give an answer like this, especially for a first question. Of course, it's a bit of both. I think there's a baseline of skill you generally need to have if you want to be very successful, especially over a long period of time. If you want to have a music career, like anyone who's making music and selling out concerts for decades is probably pretty talented to some degree. In a particular week, to have one single top the charts, there's a ton of luck involved, and skill is not enough to take you there. And we see this by the number of artists who are very skilled and very famous and who never had a number one hit. The one I talk about frequently is Bruce Springsteen, one of the most successful artists of the second half of the 20th century. He only got to number two as an artist. His song Dancing in the Dark got stuck behind Prince's When Doves Cry, which is a good example for why luck is necessary in this process. If you release the most popular song of your career and someone else puts out the most popular song of their career and it's just a little bit more popular, you may be blocked out of the top spot in that given week. So skill is necessary, but luck is also very important in this world.
So the songs that appear on the top 100 list on that number one slot, they vary in their content, right? It could be love songs. It could be songs about death. It could be a song from a musical. It could be just a one-hit wonder. Is there any, besides sitting in that top spot, is there any like connecting thread between all these songs in the last 70 years?
It's a fun question, and if there was some magical formula I uncovered, I joke in the book that I wouldn't have written a book, I just would have written the song and put it out, because it probably would have been more lucrative with a lot less effort. So there's not, there's not some secret formula that's gonna get you to write a pop hit that I discovered by listening to 70 years of number one hits. But there are some things thematically that come up again and again. I think it often helps when your song is associated with something that is not just the song itself. So over the decades, lots of songs get to number one because they were in movies, they were in television shows. If you go back even further, they were in plays. In the 1980s, the music video was vital to a song becoming a number one hit. And in this day and age, TikTok is sort of the thing. Or in the 2000s, ringtones were very important, which is like a little piece of history that people forget about. So having your song associated with something else that's not just the song itself is very helpful. At the same time, stuff that gets to the top of the charts is usually not that strange. I mean, there are some oddities that make it to number one, but most of the stuff that's getting to the top of the charts is working within styles that people are already very familiar with. So if you want to write a number one hit, you should be working with sonic palettes and song structures that are currently popular, maybe with your own little twist. But if you want to make your 8 minute, I don't know, noise rock piece, that's probably not going to send you to number one, because that's just not what your average person is listening to right now, or in that example, ever.
So the Hot 100 list is, it just kind of collects the top music throughout the United States and presents it in a ranking format. And I think we as Americans, we always love a good ranking list, to kind of see where everything stacks up. What inspired you to start tracking this list, not even just in the present, but over 70 years of the historical data of it?
I didn't intend to go on this crazy journey and turn it into a book at the beginning. Basically, I work in the music industry now. At the time, I was not working in the music industry, but I've always played music. I played in bands, like writing songs. And my goal was to just find some other musical outlet. So I would come home. I came up with this idea. I was like, oh, I'm going to listen to every number one hit. So I would come home from work every day. I'd sit down. I would look up whatever the next number one was in my journey, and I would listen. I'd play along on my guitar. It was just sort of like a way to wind down at the end of the day. But I started noticing some trends. I started tracking some information about these songs in a spreadsheet, which wasn't that weird because I've always worked with data, even at the job I was working at the time. It wasn't in music, but I was in Microsoft Excel all day. I noticed some trends, and I just felt compelled to write about it. I sent it off to a professor I had in college, and he was like, oh, this is pretty good. You should keep at it. So very slowly, I just kept listening, and when I would think I'd noticed something interesting, I would write about it. And after a certain point, I realized, oh, this is the makings of a book. But it was weird, and I think that's part of the reason the book is somewhat odd, but also interesting, is that it evolved in this very organic way.
Walk us through the history of the Billboard Hot 100. How did they start measuring this, back in 1958 when they started it, and how do they measure it today?
Billboard magazine, as the name suggests, I think it was launched in 1894. It was a magazine that covered, I would say, broadly advertising, things that people were posting on flyers and billboards and stuff like that. Slowly over time, they started to cover more things related to entertainment. And then I believe by like the 1930s, they were exclusively dedicated to music. But it was ultimately, it's a trade magazine, and it still is to some degree. I mean, they're dealing with pop stars, so there is some crossover appeal to your average person. But a lot of the stuff in Billboard magazine is stuff that only people who work in the music industry would care about. So it's pretty natural that they would try to launch a chart, something informational for people in the industry. They want to see everyone wants to know what's selling. For decades, they had tons of different little charts that tracked specific things like, oh, these are the most played songs in jukeboxes, because this was a long time ago, or these were the most sold in stores, or this was the most played on radio. In 1958, they decided, you know what, let's take all the ways people listen to music, create some formula, and decide or measure what the truly most popular song or songs in America are within a given week. So every week they would publish this list of 100 songs. It would take in, at the time, like I said, it was mostly record sales, radio, and jukebox spins. As formats evolved over the years, Billboard would start integrating those. So, as cassettes rolled out, or as the CD came about, and even more stuff like I mentioned earlier, ringtones were very popular in the 2000s. They would count ringtones towards the Hot 100. Now the Hot 100 is mostly driven by streaming. So it's the same in name, but it's a very different document, because for a long time it was largely driven by what people were going out and buying, but now it's mostly driven by what people are consuming or listening to. So it's sort of measuring a different thing. The equivalency back in the day would be, how many times did you play that CD you bought, rather than just how many times did you buy it. They still are tracking physical sales and stuff like that, so that stuff all still counts. But most people listen on streaming, so that's going to drive what gets to the top of the Hot 100 these days. And if a new format arises, I'm sure Billboard will try to capture that too.
What did you use as your data framework when you started researching this? Obviously, you have the list, but you kind of got to gather up resources everywhere else. So, how did you start building out the framework so you can start analyzing this at a deeper level?
Yeah, this was another thing that generally evolved organically. When I first started making this spreadsheet, which it's publicly available. I'm happy to send it along to you if you want to share it with anyone. But at first I would listen to these songs with a friend, and we'd both rate the song out of 10. And I was just tracking our song ratings. But then I was like, maybe I'll pull in a little bit other information, like who wrote the song, what label put it out, how long is the song, really basic facts about these songs. But then as I was listening, I would feel like I was noticing something. For example, in the first chapter, I felt like there were lots of songs about people dying, which I thought was very odd for very popular music. So then I would go back and I would be like, all right, let's fill in this information. Let's decide, let's look at the lyrics and say, how many of these are about death or dying or something else? And then suddenly I had a new data point. And because I established that, as I would go forward, I would only listen to one song per day. I would always fill out that data point. So as I became interested in stuff, I would just add more and more columns to this data set. And because of that, I was able to track some interesting or weird things that would be hard to measure if you were like, all right, I have a list of 1,100 songs. I want to track how long the introductions are. It might be tricky to figure that out if you weren't sitting down very slowly and listening one by one every day. But because of that, I was able to just track things over time as I was interested in them. And occasionally I have to backfill the data, but still.
How can the data around music inform us on culture, right? So you're looking at these long stretches of time. You're you're looking at number one hits, right? But the amount of music that we are producing is incredible. And the amount of music catalog over time, it's an immense data set. And that's too much for any person, maybe even any company to research. But what can the data around the music industry inform us about culture?
Usually things that become very popular, first of all, they're part of a larger movement. I talk about in this book related to surf rock, which was popular for a couple years in the 60s. There were some surf rock songs that got in and around the top of the charts. But if something gets to the top of the charts, it's usually indicative of a larger musical style or cultural movement. So we can see what's going on in culture widely just by looking at the most popular records. But music often just reflects there is a, I guess, a two-way relationship where, people, popular culture influence the music that comes out. But music also seems to influence how people behave in some degree, or what people think about, or how people speak. Here's a funny example of that. The term YOLO, which was popular probably about a decade ago,
My college self is, yeah, I'm harkening back here.
that was from a Drake song, from the Drake song, The Motto. Very popular song, not a number one hit, but had an impact on, the words that people were using. In the same breath, like I said, it can go the other way too, where, and this is a weird example, but in the 70s, there was this there was a streaking trend. People would run around, like, streak on football fields. There was a streaker at the Oscars in the mid 70s. Like, this was a thing. And I don't have the information about why this cropped up, but naturally there was then a number one hit that was released, or a song that was released that got to number one, called The Streak by a man named Ray Stevens, who made like novelty comedy records. It's a horrible song, but it's a good example of like something's going on, and like some musicians like, oh, I'm going to try to capitalize on this, or I'm going to react to this. So it goes both ways, I think.
In your book, you break out music by eras. Now, it's not 50s music, 60s music. You tended to lump things together in 5, 6, 7, 8 year spans, depending on the methodology here. With the weekly Hot 100 coming out, it is a rolling list. So how hard was it to kind of create these distinctive periods around the musical trends?
In one sense, it wasn't hard, because I would stop to write a chapter when I felt like I had enough to say. So there wasn't some crazy science about what I would define as a quote unquote era, or what I would include in a chapter. I would usually get like 60 or 70 songs along, and I'd be like, all right, I feel like I've noticed a couple things that I want to write about. Because that usually was over, as you said, a period of 5, 6, 7 years. There were sonic similarities between these songs. You could probably group them in some way. I just wanted to get away from this idea that like music is always defined by decades. That's a helpful way to think about music, and I do that too. I talk about 80s music and 70s music, but it's not like on January 1st, 1980, all of the trends of the 1970s end. Music usually evolves slowly over time, and I just wanted to capture that idea a little bit. Of course I have to start and end period for each chapter, but I just wanted to hammer home that idea a little bit, that you could think of a period from 1978 to 1982 as a legitimate era of music, just as much as you can think about 1970 to 1979 as an era of music. So in general, these eras were defined by when I had enough to say, but I also wanted just the idea of a musical era to make people think about, how we actually define things.
Now, if you were to kind of, give people the rough lay of the land and how music evolved, if you could do a quick synopsis of 70 years of music history, what kind of are the big waves or trends that you were seeing as you were doing this research?
Ooh, let's see how much I can boil this down in a short answer. 60s, the biggest trends is the British invasion. It's a distinctive style of rock music that became popular. It was often associated with British bands who crashed on the shores in the U.S. in the early in the mid 60s, like 1964, the Beatles first topped the charts in America. Highly important sound of that decade and very influential. The 70s, especially at the end of the decade, is really defined by disco, which is a highly rhythmic genre. The 80s is very defined by synthesizers, drum machines, using computers to make sounds, or using electronic devices to make sounds rather than traditional instruments, flutes and clarinets and guitars. The 90s, on the Hot 100, we see the rise of hip hop. And that's what I think is, from there on out, hip hop becomes the dominant cultural force throughout the 2000s. By the 2010s, we get a very distinctive form of hip hop, usually called trap music. At the same time, we get a type of rap music, sometimes called emo rap, that it's more slowed down, woozier sounds. So that's very, and just as I say before, that I want to tell people that you don't have to go by decade. Of course, I give my explanation by decade. So it really shows you how ingrained this is. So sonically, those are what I think some of the bigger trends are. But I think there are a few things that are persistent throughout, one of which is there are always going to be slow ballads, typically love songs, that are popular. It's like, you can talk about the British invasion as much as you want in the 60s, but at the same time, there were always these slow, almost melancholic love ballads that were popular, stuff by artists that you might not associate with the decade as much, like Herb Alpert. And throughout the 70s and 80s and 90s and 2000s and 2010s, we're always getting these slow love ballads. At the same time, I think one of the biggest trends throughout the 20th century is a transition from an obsession with a melody to an obsession with rhythm. And if you go back literally 100 years, genres become more focused on rhythm as you go on. You could start with like ragtime in the early 1900s up to jazz, rock music, disco. And like the logical conclusion of this seems to be hip hop, a genre that is defined more by rhythm and lyricism than it is by melody and harmony. I mean, it's not to say there's no hip hop songs that have no melodies, but you're not going to be in the shower humming "Lose Yourself" by Eminem. That's not what defines that song. And that's one of the fundamental changes throughout the 20th century, is the rise of hip hop and the rise of very rhythmic popular music.
Now, you highlight the change in relationship in music from a service to a product. But there's also quite a bit of changes technologically in how we receive music. So how you might initially have music in the early forms was a band in front of you. Maybe there was the large radio, but as time rolls on, we have things like jukeboxes, and we have a diversity of radio stations. Then you have multimedia. We have MTV. Then the internet comes along. There's all these technological advancements that changes our relationship to how we consume music. How has that impacted music over time?
Another big one, another big question. I think one of the key theses, I don't know what the plural is there, of the book is that musical evolution is often downstream of technological innovation. Now, what do I mean by that? Musicians have to work within certain technological constraints. And we see this again and again. They'll push those constraints to their edges, but we really see music is highly impacted by technology. One of the examples I talk about in the book is like, how come these days when you look at a musical artist, a band or an artist, almost always the star or the front person is a singer? That seems natural because it's been the case for the last 60 years, but it was not always the case. If you look at who the big band leaders were in the 1930s and 1940s, Glenn Miller, Artie Shaw, Tommy Dorsey, these were like trombone players and clarinet players and saxophone players. There were singers in these groups, but they did not receive top billing. In fact, when Frank Sinatra first got his start, it was with the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra. If you look at how those early records are credited, it's like Tommy Dorsey is the top line name, and then it's like lower on the record it says like with vocals by Frank Sinatra and whoever else. So why is there a transition like this? And part of it is connected to just improvements in amplification and recording technology. Back in the day, if you have a whole orchestra playing, you are not going to be able to sing loud enough to be heard. And this is the case for hundreds of years, and it's why there was a certain style of singing where people were really projecting their voice. But suddenly you get microphones making it possible for a single singer to compete with the sound of an orchestra or a big band. You also have microphones improve, or recording technology improve, so that you can record a wider variety of sounds. No longer do I have to shout into a giant horn for my voice to be recorded. You know, I could sing with like a soft whisper, like Frank Sinatra or Bing Crosby, and that's going to be recorded. But that vocal styling is only possible when you get improved microphone technology. It's only possible for singers, or not only, I shouldn't say only possible. It's largely possible, or more possible, for singers to be superstars when they can be heard singing. And we see this again and again. You know, you can go decade by decade and you see how artists are shaped by technology, whether that's recording technology or listening technology. They have to play within the bounds of whatever technology is around.
America has changed quite a bit since the 1958 when the list started here. How has America's changing demographics and structure, maybe a little less rural, a little more urban, how has that changed the way sound and the genres and styles of music that was created?
People from different backgrounds make different styles of music. I think that almost goes without saying. One thing I try to capture in the book is, especially around genres, is that we have particular conceptions of certain genres are often tied to race and gender more than they're necessarily tied to what the music actually sounds like. So, for example, in chapter 6, I do a little study about classic rock radio, R&B radio, and oldies radio, and I just map out the gender and the race of every artist on those stations. I have a huge sample, and you see that classic rock is largely dominated by white artists, R&B stations are largely dominated by black artists. And it's not to say that people of different ethnicities don't make different styles of music. I mean, that's totally fine, but I think we draw these lines where they do not have to be drawn. And I think there are countless examples of songs that say would be considered, just by the sound of the music, would be considered, say, a classic rock song or an R&B song, but they're not because the artist looks a certain way or is a certain gender. And that really shapes how we think about, I think, how we think about race and gender and how we think about genre.
Yeah, it is kind of, over time. I think one of the things that's kind of interesting, maybe in present day here, is that we're seeing a little bit more, maybe like country music and stuff kind of hit the top, which is, you were talking hip hop here was, dominant in the 90s and it's always been kind of through. But then there's also like that mix, like is it Shabuzi, is mixing, country. So there's some different crossovers and stuff that's happening. Latin music is becoming hugely popular on the American charts as well. That's a changing demographic story. So when I think back to listening to my dad's station, we were driving around the truck, it was like Beach Boys, Surf Summer, those songs, and just like what popular music is today is just completely different between two generations.
Oh, definitely. I mean, music changes fast, and your observation about country is a totally valid one. Country seems to move. Of course, country's always been around, and it's always popular, at least in its own bubble, but it seems to cross over into the mainstream like every couple decades. In the late 50s, early 60s, there was a particular sort of polished country sound, sometimes called countrypolitan, that was popular. In the 70s, some artists like John Denver and Glenn Campbell crossed over. The 90s, Garth Brooks and company were huge. But in the last 10 years, there's definitely been significant crossover. And I think with artists like Morgan Wallen Zach Bryan, Shabuzi's a good example. And I think many of those artists, maybe not Zach Bryan, but the others, are making quote unquote country music, but it's sort of dressed up with like hip hop sonics, and it is a cross of styles in a way that it makes it very distinct from, you know, a country song 30 years before, an Alan Jackson song. So that's definitely that's a very good observation.
Why don't you break it down the industry a little bit more? Obviously, we kind of think of music in terms of artists and performers, but there's also this connection point of the labels and the distribution. And now in the modern age, you have independent platforms where people are able to, produce their own music and share it independently. But historically, can you kind of describe to us how that relationship between the artist and the label occurred, and then how that influenced what was put onto the charts?
Yeah, I mean, for decades, if you wanted to have a music career, you effectively had to work with a label. Part of there were many reasons for that. You know, labels had the relationships with, say, radio stations, but I think the biggest issue was distribution. If I could record the greatest song of all time in some cheap studio, how am I going to get that song printed onto 100,000 pieces of vinyl and shipped throughout the United States? Even more, how am I going to get it shipped around the world? Like, that's a very difficult physical, logistical issue that a single musician simply could not solve. So labels cropped up to, they would front you money to record, but they would deal with all of those issues. They may have worked with an independent distributor, but they were providing legitimate services for artists. Despite, there were valid artist complaints about how record deals were structured at the time, but that was really the labels. The biggest thing that the label's doing is, we're going to get your recording out there. We're going to get it on the radio. We are going to get it into stores. So labels had a tremendous amount of power. They were the gatekeepers, and you really could not get past the gate without working with one of them. This starts to break down in the 2000s. I mean, even sort of in the 90s, where the internet comes on, or the World Wide Web becomes accessible to many people. By the 2000s, there are ways to start recording sort of cheaply anywhere where you could bring a computer. Distribution becomes very cheap. You went from, all right, I got to ship a CD all around the world, to, I'm going to click a single button and my song is going to be available on every digital music store for anyone to purchase around the globe. Suddenly, like, it makes you rethink, maybe I don't need a label. I mean, this day and age where physical is not as important as it once was, what service is the label really providing? Distribution is not an issue in the way that it was decades before. So that puts a lot of power in the hands of artists. Labels still persist, and I think what labels these days are good at is pouring gasoline on the fire. If you have a song that's starting to pop off, they still have the resources to bring it to radio, to get you on TV, to do X, Y, and Z to really make the song pop off. And I think if you want to get to the top of the charts, by and large, you still need a label. But if you want to have a music career, you don't necessarily need one anymore. There are no gates, or there are fewer gates than there once were.
I think you got to look at it like, where is the money coming from? So maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit more. Is, how does the label make money? How does the artist make money? And then, doesn't that cause a bit of tension between the two?
There's tremendous amounts of tension between. I mean, anytime you hear artists complaining about the label, that this is what the tension is about, is the money. The way record contracts worked for decades, and honestly, they still sort of work like this, is an artist is fronted money, and the label owns the recording. The artist, if you wrote the song, you get to keep the songwriting share. You won't make any money back until the label recoups your advance out of your share. So you're effectively getting an interest-free loan. The problem is, let's say the label gives you $60,000. You're not going to make any money until the label makes 600. Let's say you had a 10% royalty. You're not going to make any money till the label makes $600,000, because You have to recoup your advance, that's 60,000, out of your share. So even though they've made 10 times whatever they paid you, you've just crossed the threshold of making it back out of your royalty share. This naturally makes people very angry because it's clear like the label's making a ton of money. Because for you to recoup your advance, they've already made multiples back of what they've given you. Of course, like I said, it's like basically an interest-free loan. You never have to pay it back if your music never sells. So there are, there are points in favor of each. Deals have definitely gotten a little bit more fair, as especially with the internet, it's a lot easier for artists to talk to each other to figure out what is fair and what isn't fair about a record deal. Where back in the day it was super opaque. A lot of artists got really screwed and just beyond the general structure of these contracts. They were just set up in a way where it was basically impossible to recoup your advance. So that's why they're always mad at each other. Because, the artist is making the songs. They feel like they deserve to be paid, and labels will just be like, well, we gave you money up front to record and do X, Y, and Z, so unless you make that back, you're not going to make another dime. Creates tension, to say the least. But that's a tale as old as the music industry.
In the modern age here, the technology's gotten crazy with sampling and, the ability to add in lines from other music. And then I think you had a graph in there about the amount of intellectual property lawsuits that are happening, in the 2000s here. It's just exponential. How has the protection of intellectual property really come to a head here now that there's wide open distribution, there's technology that allows you to sample virtually anything, anywhere, and then high quality equipment here that allows you to record and produce at a high rate?
This is sort of one of my the pet issues that I talk about a lot. Is I think copyright terms last too long, which seems like a very anti-artist stance. I don't think it is, because when you see how copyright over really long periods actually functions, I think that ends up being anti-artist. So right now, copyright in the U.S. lasts the life of the author or songwriter or musician or whoever, plus 70 years. So because Paul McCartney is still alive, and I hope Paul McCartney never dies, but I don't know, let's say he lives another 10 years. That'll be 2036, and then it's 70 years after his death. So we'd be into the 2100s before the Beatles catalog entered the public domain, which is wild. And because of that, no one can, if you are going to sample, say, a Beatles song, you need permission from whoever's controlling all the Beatle intellectual property. If you want to use a Beatles song in a movie or a television show, you need permission from them. And as the music industry has become more financialized, we're seeing private equity firms buy up tons and tons of copyrights, and they want to enforce those copyrights. And there are more mechanisms to be able to enforce that stuff, to make sure you're collecting your money if your song is sampled or if it's covered. And, that's a good thing. I mean, when something is when it's protected by copyright, like artists, songwriters, whoever should get paid. It's just, since it's over such a long period, like literally goes beyond death, you end up getting some weird, I think, perverse incentives that lead to lawsuits that should never happen over music that was released, 100 years ago. It always struck me as kind of ridiculous. And it's only benefiting the most successful artist. Most music from the 1960s is not getting played anymore. Most music is not getting played 3 years after it's released. Only the most successful music is going to be played 100 years later. So you end up just enriching the most successful artists and their heirs, probably 2 generations of their heirs, which feels silly. Like, do Paul McCartney's grandchildren really need to be collecting the Beatles royalties? It would be tough to convince me of that.
When it comes to the music here, you bring up, going back to genre a little bit, there's these genres that kind of pop up. I think you bring up surf music, you bring up disco. And in your book, I really liked this part on genre here, because it's a term that's kind of necessary, but it's very incomplete, in that we try to use this term of, well, this artist is in this genre, but, really they're kind of one of one, so nothing quite fits perfectly. But also in a way, you kind of need to have it in order to categorize and distribute music a little bit more. What radio station you're going to put on? What's relatively similar material? So why is this a naming or labeling tool we got to have, but is just woefully insufficient for how complex music is?
Yeah, I mean, every time you see an interview, especially with the young artists, they're always like, when you ask what type of music they make, they're like, "Oh, my music transcends genre or whatever." Like, I think stuff like that's usually BS. I mean, usually it, it falls within the bounds of a certain sonic style. And to your point, genre, it's very necessary. It's like, how do we talk about, how would we talk about things if there were not ways to categorize them? It would be very difficult, especially when you're talking about something shorthand. It's nice to be able to mention a style, and the person I am speaking to generally knows what songs I'm talking about, what artists I'm including. The problem, as you said, is I think we use this term genre we think it means one thing, which is what does the music sound like? When in reality, we use it to describe other things, which are typically what does the artist look like? When did they make music and who did they make it with? Or who is listening to this music and where are they listening to it? I don't think it's a stretch of the imagination to say like, oh, R&B music is made mostly by black people and it's mostly listened to by black people. And country music is made largely by white people, listened to by white people. And historically, we see that that's how those genres actually, those categories came about. It was more of a marketing tool to market music to specific demographic groups. But then if you go and listen to an R&B station, or you go and listen to a country station, you go and listen to a classic rock station, you start to see how fuzzy these things actually are. It's, all right, I'm going to hear a Phil Collins ballad on a classic rock station. Well, if that's the case, why can't I hear a Lionel Richie ballad on a classic rock station? You could either argue both should be included or both should not be included. But it just becomes clear that we're not just talking about how music sounds when we are calling something a certain genre. So, what I think I advocate for in the book is genres are helpful, as I've said, but we should try to use genre to actually describe how something sounds rather than using it as a euphemism, whether knowingly or not, for like, oh, this is this artist's ethnic background, and that's why we're going to call it this genre. So yeah, I think it's a fun, complicated topic.
You talk about genre here, and maybe it might be a radio station. It's a classic rock radio station, and if you're driving with somebody and they like on that station they play Linkin Park, and see how viscerally mad that individual gets that Linkin Park's being played on the class. That's only for 80s music. It's a labeling tool, but you have genres, maybe broad categories, but then those categories get infinitely sliced down. And I think you call it surf music and disco as two examples of ones that really like, they appear, they burn hot for a little while, and then they kind of recede or maybe get kind of absorbed into other categories of music a little bit more. Why is it that some have a little bit more sticking or staying power? And then how come some like never quite reach maybe number one hit level in prominence?
That's a fun question. I mean, I think part of it is just how broad our definition of the genre is. If I say rock music, you could include everything from, say, the Beatles to Nirvana or Green Day. There are, the Beatles were making music with guitars, so was Kurt Cobain and friends. But they're making very different music. But if we call all of this broadly rock music, then of course that genre is going to live on for a much longer time than something that's a very narrow scope. Though, even so, I think certain things, there's only so much you can do with them or say about them. Like surf rock's a good example. It's like, how much can we really sustain a genre if we're mostly singing about surfing. If we're mostly singing about driving, the hot rod down to the beach with the girls, I think certain styles just there is more there are more things you can possibly say with them. Certain styles are just, they're smaller in scope and that's fine, but you're not going to get a 30-year movement based around that genre. Um, so I think that's broadly it is after a certain point, things become exhausted to some degree and a new style has to rise for people to work with. The time frame for people to exhaust all the ideas is different from genre to genre. So, that's I think very broadly why that happens.
Maybe let's pivot into a little bit of modern music here. Do you think that like the modern pop star is found or made?
A little of both, which is always an unsatisfying answer. I think there are. I'll give you I think there's a few different ways to think about this. If you go back far enough in the past, again, where labels were truly gatekeepers, it was sort of on the label to find someone to develop that talent. Maybe you hear Whitney Houston singing at a club. Maybe you hear a young Mariah Carey, and you're like, okay, we're going to develop you as a talent, and we are going to make you a pop star. I don't think you could make anyone a pop star, similar to the conversation we were having at the beginning. Like, there probably has to be some baseline level of skill, but there was some sort of ability to make a pop star, and that has not completely disappeared. For example, one of the biggest boy bands of the 2010s was One Direction. It spawned a bunch of solo careers, the biggest of which is Harry Styles, who actually, the day we're recording this, just put out a new song. They got together on the television show The Voice. I think The Voice, or The X Factor. I don't know. One of these television competitions. If you go back and look up their first audition songs from that show, even Harry Styles, like, they're not that good. Harry Styles was made a pop star. He had to work at it, but it's not like this talent, this diamond was just pulled from the ground. At the same time, in this day and age, I think labels have a little bit less to do with that because I can cultivate my audience online. I can release all of my music. So by the time a label comes along these days, your career is going to be a bit more mature. And I think because of that, they are finding pop stars more than making them these days. Whereas back in the day, artist development was a little bit more of a thing where you could make a pop star. There's, again, in both cases, there's probably some baseline level of skill or, I don't know, charisma necessary. But beyond that, I think it has shifted over the years.
How do you think online music and streaming services are changing the way we interact with music here? Because I was actually just thinking about this the other day while I was playing Spotify, as I was, listening to a song, but I wasn't like passive listening to the song. I was actually looking up my next song while I was listening to that song. And it's never before kind of been like that, where, if you had your iPad or iPod, you were kind of listening to it and you listen to the song through and then would go through the playlist here. How has the on-demand ability of streaming impacted the way we taste and consume music?
And this is another great question, and I think there are good and bad things about streaming. I mean, still, I'm overwhelmed by the fact that I can open up an app on my phone or on my computer, and I get access to nearly any piece of recorded music in history. I mean, it's overwhelming, especially when you think about 30 years ago. What am I going to listen to? It's whatever is in my CD case, whatever is on my little CD stand. And you could have hundreds of CDs, but it's still completely dwarfed by what you have access to through the internet when you have access to in streaming. And that's incredible. At the same time, if I have 100 CDs, I'm probably going to get to know all of those pretty intimately. I always think about this experience of CDs we had in my car, my parents' car growing up, where I just have an intimate knowledge about some of these albums, some that I don't even think are great albums, just because they were in the car. And, our car at that time had like a 6 CD changer. That felt like a million different songs. But even so, you really got to develop a relationship with this music. Now, you can still do that in the streaming age, but there's always something else to listen to. At the same time, I think streaming, unless you're careful, can really lead to a passive relationship with music. It's very easy just to open the service, click play, and not think about what's even being played. My fiance, actually, she got her top songs this year from Spotify, and she saw what her number one song was, and she was like, I don't know what this is. And then she listened to it, and she was like, oh, I know what this is. It just she always listens to like the daily mixes that Spotify puts on, so she's a bit more of a passive listener. This had just been put on a bunch of her mixes, and she'd heard it a bunch of times, but she never consciously knew what the song was. It was just something on in the background. So you end up with a situation where your most listened to song is something you don't even know, which I don't think is a good thing. Not that everyone was actively listening to music back in the day. Tons of people would just turn the radio on and listen to whatever was being played. But there, like with all things, there's pros and cons to how streaming has reshaped our relationship with music.
Well, we're coming up on time here, Chris. So I won't keep you too much longer. I got one final question here. Is when you kind of think, you look back at 7 decades worth of music, has your perception of musical legacy changed at all, especially when you look back at maybe some of these artists? Word comes out, there's controversy, there's changes. What is your idea of musical legacy going forward?
One of the fun things about listening to all those number one hits is I feel like I just have a wider appreciation for different styles of music. It's popular music, so there's nothing too strange out there, but you just get to, like, I never was actively listening to disco until I went and did this whole listening journey. And I was like, oh, there's tons and tons of great disco songs that I would have missed out on otherwise. It just made me realize how more impactful the legacy of that genre is, just because I was never listening to it. Sometimes we're blinded by the fact that we only listen to certain styles or genres. The world of music is very, very large, and just because something is big in our eyes doesn't mean it's big and important to everybody else, and vice versa. Just because something isn't important to us doesn't mean it's not big and impactful. So I try to take a more global view of what something's legacy is. At the same time, I mean, you brought it up, like artists who they end up having problematic behavior. I write about this a little bit in chapter 9 of the book. I've mostly started falling on the side of like, listen to whatever you want. It's up to the history books and the courts to figure that stuff out, because I just think we never consistently apply like a moral standard to the artists we listen to. Like, should I be going out and checking? I don't know. It just seemed, what can we expect listeners to really do? Do they have to litigate the behavior of artists that they like? I mean, there are hundreds, thousands of years of artists with problematic behavior. So I think as part of their legacy, I mean, you should totally, you don't tell the Phil Spector story without the fact that he was abusive to women and he murdered someone in the 2000s and was convicted for it. It's like, you don't have to ignore it, but I don't think you should feel bad if you put on the best Phil Spector productions of the 1960s. I think the stuff like that is a tough question. But people can ultimately do what they want. I'm not going to get mad at you if you don't want to listen to some artist ever again.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate your work. Where can people find your work and your book?
I am an easy guy to find online. My name is Chris Dalla Riva. I'm on most social platforms under C. Dalla Riva Music. I post most regularly on TikTok and Instagram, and I have a weekly newsletter called Can't Get Much Higher that is about music and data. But my book is the thing I am shilling right now, and it's available online wherever you would purchase books. So grab a copy if you enjoy it. Reach out to me. I love talking music.
Chris, appreciate you. Have a great day.